Welcome back to Dimebag Darren World Headquarters here in the corner of my living room, and I'm happy to say we are moving on in our story, Isaac Asimov's Foundation, and we are at book 3 at this point within our, many book. I don't even know how many books there are, honestly, but book 3, The Mayors, is where we are, and chapter 1. Chapter 1, The Four Kingdoms. The name given to those portions of the province of Anacreon which broke away from the First Empire in the early years of the foundational era to form independent and short-lived kingdoms. The largest and most powerful of these was Anacreon itself, which in area. Undoubtedly the most interesting aspect of the history of the Four Kingdoms involves the strange society forced temporarily upon it during the administration of Salvor Hardin. Encyclopedia Galactica. A deputation? That Salvor Hardin had seen it coming made it none the more pleasant. On the contrary, he found anticipation distinctly annoying. Johann Lee advocated extreme measures. I don't see that we waste any time. They can't do anything until next election, legally anyway, and that gives us a year. Give them the brush off. Hardin pursed his lips. Lee, you'll never learn. In 40 years I've known you, you've never once learned the gentle art of sneaking up from behind. It's not my way of fighting. Yes, I know that. I suppose that's why you're the only man I trust. He paused and reached for a cigar. We've come a long way, Lee, since we engineered our coup against the encyclopedists way back. I'm getting old. 62. Do you ever think how fast those 30 years went? Lee snorted. I don't feel old, and I'm 66. Yes, but I haven't your digestion. He had long since stopped wishing for the mild vegan tobacco of his youth. Those days when the planet Terminus had trafficked with every part of the galactic empire belonged in the limbo to which all good old days go. Toward the same limbo where the galactic empire was heading. He wondered who the new emperor was, or if there were a new emperor at all, or any empire. Space. 30 years from now, since the breakup of communications here at the edge of the galaxy, the whole universe of Terminus had consisted of itself and the four surrounding kingdoms. How the mighty have fallen. Kingdoms! They were prefixed in the old days, all part of the same province, which in turn had been part of a sector, which in turn had been part of a quadrant, which in turn had been part of the all-embracing galactic empire. And now that the empire had lost control over the farthest reaches of the galaxy, these little splinter groups of planets became kingdoms, with comic opera kings and nobles and petty meaningless wars, and a life that went on pathetically among the ruins. A civilization falling, atomic power forgotten, science fading into mythology, until the Foundation stepped in. The Foundation that Harry Seldon had established for just that purpose here on Terminus. Lee was at the window and his voice broke in on Hardin's reverie. They've come, and in a last model ground car, the young pups. He took a few uncertain steps towards the door, then looked at Hardin. Hardin smiled and waved him back. I've given orders to have them brought up here. Here? What for? You're making them too important. Why go through all the ceremonies of an official mayor's audience? I'm getting too old for red tape. Besides which, flattery is useful when dealing with youngsters, particularly when it doesn't commit you to anything. He winked. Sit down, Lee, and give me your moral backing. I'll need it with this young Cermak. That fellow Cermak is dangerous. He's got a following, Hardin, so don't underestimate him. Have I ever underestimated anybody? Well then, arrest him. You can accuse him of something or other afterwards. Hardin ignored that last piece of advice. They're here, Lee. In response to the signal, he stepped on the pedal beneath his desk, and the door slid aside. They filed in, the four that composed the deputation, and Hardin waved them gently to the armchairs that faced his desk in a semicircle. They bowed and waited for the mayor to speak first. Hardin flicked open the curiously carved silver lid of the cigar box that once belonged to George Farah of the old Board of Trustees in the long-dead days of the encyclopedists. It was a genuine Empire product from Santani, though the cigars it now contained were homegrown. One by one, with grave solemnity, the four of the deputation accepted cigars and lit up in ritualistic fashion. Seth Cermak was second from the right, the youngest of the young group and the most interesting, with his bristly yellow mustache trimmed precisely and the sunken eyes of a certain color. The other three Hardin dismissed almost immediately. They were rank and file on the face of them. It was on Cermak that he concentrated. The Cermak who had already, in his first term in the city council, turned that sedate body topsy-turvy more than once, and it was to Cermak that he said, I've been particularly anxious to see you, councilman, ever since your very excellent speech last month. Your attack on the foreign policy of this government was a most capable one. Cermak's eyes smoldered. Your interest honors me. The attack may or may not have been capable, but it was certainly justified. Perhaps. Your opinions are yours, of course. Still, you're rather young. It's a fault that most people are guilty of at some period of their life. You became mayor of the city when you were only 2 years younger than I am now. Hardin smiled to himself. The yearling was a cool customer. He said, I take it now that you've come to see me concerning the same foreign policy that annoys you so greatly in the council chamber. Are you speaking for your three colleagues, or must I listen to each of you separately? There were quick mutual glances among the four young men, and a slight flickering of eyelids. Cermak said grimly, I speak for the people of Terminus, the people who are now truly represented in the rubber-stamp body they call the council. I see. Then go ahead. It comes to this, Mr. Mayor. We are dissatisfied. By we, you mean the people, don't you? Cermak stared hostilely, sensing a trap, and replied coldly, I believe that my views reflect those of the majority of the voters of Terminus. Does that suit you? Well, a statement like that is all the better for proof. But go on anyway. You're dissatisfied. Yes, dissatisfied with the party who, for over 30 years, has been stripping Terminus defenseless against the inevitable attack from the outside. I see. And therefore, go on. It's nice of you to anticipate. And therefore, we are forming a new political party, one that will stand for the immediate needs of Terminus and not for a mystic manifest destiny of your future empire. We are going to throw you and your lick-spittle clique of appeasers out of City Hall, and that soon. Unless, there's always an unless, you know. Not much of one in this case, unless you resign now. I'm not asking you to change your policies. I wouldn't trust you that far. Your promises are worth nothing. An outright resignation is all we'll take. I see. Hardin crossed his legs and teetered his chair back on 2 legs. That's your ultimatum. Nice of you to give me warning, but you see, I rather think I'll ignore it. Don't think of it as a warning, Mr. Mayor. It was an announcement of principles and of action. This new party has already been formed, and it will begin its official activities tomorrow. There was neither room nor desire for compromise, and frankly, it was only our recognition of your services to the city that induced us to offer this easy way out. I didn't think you'd take it, but my conscience is clear. The next election will be a more forceful and quite irresistible reminder that resignation is necessary. He rose and motioned the rest up. Hardin lifted his arm. Hold on, sit down. Seth Cermak seated himself once more, with just a shade too much alacrity, and Hardin smiled behind a straight face. In spite of his words, he was waiting for an offer, any offer. Hardin said, In exactly what way do you want our foreign policy changed? Do you want us to attack the Four Kingdoms now at once, and all four simultaneously? I make no such suggestion, Mr. Mayor. It is our simple proposition that all appeasement cease immediately. Throughout your administration, you've carried out a policy of scientific aid to the kingdoms. You've given them atomic power. You've helped them rebuild power plants on their territories. You've established medical clinics, chemical laboratories, and factories. Well, and your objection? You've done this in order to keep them from attacking us. With these as bribes, you've been playing the fool in a colossal game of blackmail in which you've allowed Terminus to be sucked dry, with the result that now we are at the mercy of these barbarians. In what way? Because you've given them the power, given them the weapons, actually serviced the ships of their navies. They are infinitely stronger than they were 3 decades ago. And their demands are increasing with their new weapons, and they will satisfy their demands at once by violent annexation of Terminus. Isn't that the way blackmail usually ends? And your remedy? Stop the bribes immediately while you can. Spend your effort in strengthening Terminus itself and attack first. Hardin watched the young fellow's little blonde mustache with an almost morbid interest. Cermak felt sure of himself where he wouldn't talk so much. There was no doubt that his remarks were the reflection of a pretty huge segment of the population. Pretty huge. His voice did not betray the slightest perturbed current of his thoughts. It was almost negligent. Are you finished? For the moment. Well then, do you notice the framed statement I have on the wall behind me? Read it, if you will. Cermak's lips twitched. It says, violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. That is an old man's doctrine, Mr. Mayor. I applied it as a young man, Mr. Councilman, and successfully. You were busily being born when it happened, but perhaps you may have read something of it in school. He eyed Cermak closely and continued in measured tones. When Harry Seldon established the foundation here, it was for the ostensible purpose of producing a great encyclopedia, and for 50 years we followed that will-o'-the-wisp before discovering what he was really after. By that time it was almost too late. With communications with the central regions of the old empire broke down, we found ourselves a world of scientists concentrated into a single city, possessing no industries and surrounded by newly created kingdoms, hostile and largely barbarous. We were a tiny island of atomic power in this ocean of barbarism, and an infinitely valuable prize. Anacreon, then as now, the most powerful of the Four Kingdoms, demanded and actually established a military base upon Terminus. And then rulers of the city, the encyclopedists, knew very well that this was only a preliminary to taking over the entire planet. That is how matters stood when I assumed actual government. What would you have done? Cermak shrugged his shoulders. That's an academic question. Of course I know what you did. I'll repeat it anyway. The temptation was great, to muster what force we could and put up a fight. It's the easiest way out and the most satisfactory to self-respect, but nearly invariably the stupidest. You would have done it. You and your talk of attack first. What I did instead was to visit the three other kingdoms one by one and point out to each that to allow the secret of atomic power to fall into the hands of Anacreon was the quickest way of cutting their own throats, and suggest gently that they do the obvious thing. That was all. 1 month after the Anacreonian force had landed on Terminus, their king received a joint ultimatum from his three neighbors. In 7 days, the last Anacreonian was off Terminus. Now tell me, where was the need for violence? The young councilman regarded his cigar stub thoughtfully and tossed it into the incinerator chute. I fail to see the analogy. Insulin will bring a diabetic to normal without the faintest need of a knife. But appendicitis needs an operation. You can't help that. When other courses have failed, what is left but, as you put it, the last refuge? It's your fault that we're driven to it. I? Ah, yes. Again, my policy of appeasement. You still seem to lack grasp of the fundamental necessities of our position. Our problem wasn't over with the departure of the Anacreonians. They had just begun. The 4 kingdoms were more our enemies than ever, for each wanted atomic power, and each was kept off our throats only for fear of the other 3. We are balanced on the point of a very sharp sword, and the slightest sway in any direction. If, for instance, one kingdom becomes too strong, or if 2 form a coalition, you understand? Certainly. That was the time to begin all-out preparations for war. On the contrary, that was the time to begin all-out prevention of war. I played them one against another. I helped each in turn. I offered them science, trade, education, scientific medicine. I made Terminus of more value to them as a flourishing world than as a military prize. It worked for 30 years. Yes, but you were forced to surround these scientific gifts with the most outrageous mummery. You made half religion, half balderdash out of it. You've erected a hierarchy of priests and complicated, meaningless ritual. Hardin frowned. What of that? I don't see that it has anything to do with the argument at all. I started that way first because the barbarians looked upon our science as a sort of magical sorcery, and it was easiest to get them to accept it on that basis. The priesthood built itself, and if we help it along, we are only following the line of least resistance. It is a minor matter. But the priests are in charge of the power plants. That is not a minor matter. True, but we have trained them. Their knowledge of their tools is purely empirical, and they have a firm belief in the mummery that surrounds them. And if one pierces through the mummery, and has the genius to brush aside empiricism, what is to prevent him from learning actual techniques and selling them to the most satisfactory bidder? What price are value to the kingdoms then? Little chance of that, Sir Mac. You're being superficial. The best men on the planets of the kingdoms are sent here to the Foundation each year and educated into the priesthood. And the best of these remain here as research students. If you think those that are left with practically no knowledge of the elementals of science, or worse still, the distorted knowledge that the priests receive, can penetrate at a bound to atomic power, to electronics, and to the theory of the hyperwarp, you have a very romantic and very foolish idea of science. It takes lifetimes of training and an excellent brain to get that far. Johann Lee had risen abruptly during the foregoing speech and left the room. He had returned now, and when Hardin finished speaking, he bent to the superior's ear. A whisper was exchanged, and then a leaden cylinder. Then, with one short hostile look at the deputation, Lee resumed his chair. Hardin turned the cylinder end for end in his hands, watching the deputation through his lashes, and then he opened it, with a hard, sudden twist, and only Cermak had the sense not to throw a rapid look at the rolled paper that fell out. In short, gentlemen, he said, the government is of the opinion that it knows what it's doing. He read as he spoke. There were lines of intricate, meaningless code that covered the page and 3 penciled words scrawled in one corner that carried the message. He took it in at a glance and tossed it casually into the incinerator shaft. That ends the interview, I'm afraid. Glad to have met you all. Thanks for coming. He shook hands with each in a perfunctory fashion, and they filed out. Hardin had almost gotten out of the habit of laughing, but after Cermak and his 3 silent partners were well out of earshot, he indulged in a dry chuckle and bent an amused look on Lee. How did you like that battle of bluffs, Lee? Lee snorted grumpily. I'm not sure he was bluffing. Treat him with kid gloves, and he's quite liable to win the next election, just as he says. Oh, quite likely, if nothing happens first. Make sure that they don't happen in the wrong direction this time, Hardin. I tell you, this Cermak has a following. What if he doesn't wait till the next election? There was a time when you and I put things through violently, in spite of your slogan about what violence is. Hardin cocked an eyebrow. You are pessimistic today, Lee, and singularly contrary, too, or you wouldn't speak of violence. Our own little push was carried through without loss of life, you remember. It was a necessary measure put through at the proper moment, and went over smoothly, painlessly, and all but effortlessly. As for Cermak, he's up against a different proposition. You and I, Lee, are not the encyclopedists. We stand prepared. Sick your men on these youngsters in a nice way, old fellow. Don't let them know they're being watched, but eyes open, you understand. Lee laughed in sour amusement. I'd be a fine one to wait for your orders, wouldn't I, Hardin? Cermak and his men have been under surveillance for a month now. The mayor chuckled. Got in first, did you? All right. By the way, he observed and added softly, Ambassador Verasov is returning to Terminus temporarily, I hope. There was a short silence, faintly horrified, and then Lee said, What was the message? Are things breaking down already? Don't know. I can't tell until I hear what Verasov has to say. They may be, though after all, they have to before the election. But what are you looking so dead about? Because I don't know how it's going to turn out. You're too deep, Hardin, and you're playing the game too close to your chest. Thou too, Brutus, murmured Hardin, and aloud. Does that mean you're going to join Cermak's new party? Lee smiled against his will. All right, you win. How about lunch now?